Several months ago, I published a video analysing the potential roles for the Royal Australian Navy's Arafura class offshore patrol vessel, both in its present configuration and in some plausible alternative configurations that might have seen it transcend its current role as an oversized patrol ship into something more broadly useful. Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, it seems that the vessel's manufacturer, CivMec, have been thinking along similar lines. At the Indo-Pacific Defence Conference in Sydney a few weeks ago, CivMec presented what they're calling the Arafura Capability Enhancement, an upgrade package which would see the vessels upgunned and kitted out for anti-surface and anti-submarine warfare. This video, which is a postscript to the earlier Arafura video, will look at this upgrade package, consider its potential impact on the class, and assess what it could mean if it were adopted. Since this is meant to be a postscript video, I won't spend too long detailing the Arafura class or its history. Feel free to go back and watch that earlier video for more details. For now, suffice it to say that the Arafura is an 80-metre long, 1,600-tonne offshore patrol vessel. The current model is very lightly armed, with its heaviest weapon being a single 25mm cannon, which is supplemented by a pair of 50 cal machine guns. As of the time of writing, 2 Arafuras have been delivered to the Navy, HMAS Arafura and New Ship Air, which is awaiting commissioning, and a third, New Ship Pilbara, has been launched but is still being fitted out. The remaining 3, all being built in CivMec's Henderson Yard in Western Australia, are all expected to be commissioned by the end of the decade. So, with that brief preamble out of the way, let's have a look at what CivMec are proposing. Under the Capability Enhancement package, which is intended to be added to ships which have already been launched rather than necessarily integrated into the ships currently in production, CivMec have proposed the following. First, replacing the 25mm main gun with a 57mm Bofors, the same type of weapon which is currently in use on the referenced Darussalam class, with the primary intended use case being for air defence against drones and similar low-level threats. Next, installing a rear-facing quad naval strike missile launcher astern, located in between the containerised system mounts. Third, installing those containerised systems, with their initial proposal focusing on loitering munition launchers. And finally, the installation of a CAPDAS-1 towed array sonar, intended for use in concert with other assets as part of multi-static sonar operations. At first glance, this looks great. It offers immediate use cases for the Arafura in wartime operations, but seems to use primarily either off-the-shelf modular components or equipment which is already in use in other versions of the class, for which it more or less has to be assumed that the ship was originally designed, reducing risk and cost associated with major redesigns. So, let's dig a little deeper into what this could mean. But before we get too deep, I want to make clear what this upgrade package is, and what it isn't. CivMec presented this upgraded Indo-Pack as an unsolicited bid, with, as far as is known, no specific request from the federal government or from Navy, and no guarantee that the upgrade package is going to be accepted in its current form or in any form at all. The government may be perfectly happy with the Arafura as they exist, or may simply not want to start upgrading a class of vessels which is still deep in initial construction, with half not having even hit the water yet, and only one having been commissioned. So that begs the question, why talk about it at all? Well, 2 main reasons. First, we know that the government aren't, in fact, perfectly happy with the Arafura. The DSR called it, quote, an inefficient use of resources for civil maritime security operations, end quote, and stated that the class, quote, does not possess the survivability and self-defense systems to contribute to a surface combatant mission, end quote. In other words, it's too big and too crew-intensive to do the constabulary role, but too poorly armed to take on a warfighting role. This status, as neither fish nor fowl, already saw the Arafura order cut in half, and there's no reason to assume the official position has changed in the last couple of years. The second big reason to pay attention here is that this proposal has come from the shipbuilders themselves. It's all good and well for the likes of me to say that a given class needs X system or Y sensor, but those of us on the outside looking in don't have access to the detailed plans or the IP to really determine, beyond educated guesses, what really might be possible, and what might be precluded for whatever reason. But that's not the case for the manufacturer. While a potential tendency towards over-promising for the sake of salesmanship always has to be considered, it's a relatively safe bet that if CivMec says the Arafura can be equipped this way, then odds are good that it probably can, or at least that there aren't any immediately obvious fatal flaws. So, with our reasons for interest established and out of the way, let's look at some of the strengths of the offering. First, it would finally see the Arafura equipped with a meaningful armament and sensor suite, which could allow the class to take on a few specific warship-like roles, though CivMec were quick to point out that this upgrade isn't intended to bring the OPV up to even the level of a Tier 2 combatant within the RAN. Rather, the intention seems to be that the Arafuras would serve to supplement larger and more capable classes, bringing, for example, additional naval strike missiles to bolster a salvo launch against a hostile service target, or providing an additional towed array sonar to turn single-ship operations into multi-ship operations, potentially including multi-static sonar array operations, wherein more than one towed array are used to separate the transmitter from the receiver. These kind of operations, in addition to being potentially more accurate and longer range than single sonar ops, also have the advantage of allowing sonar receivers to potentially stay stealthy and avoid detection entirely from hostile subsurface targets. This is going to be an increasingly valuable capability as the RAN barrels towards a major ASW role for its surface fleet, with both the Hunter and Mogami classes being extremely stealthy and capable anti-submarine specialists. Another complementary capability that an upgraded Arafura could bring to major surface combatants would be a focus on small boat and kamikaze drone defense using loitering munitions. CivMec's reference model at Indopac saw the Arafura's two modular ISO container-sized spaces filled by launchers for what looked like a total of about 64 loitering munitions. These weapons, which can be both cheap and quite potent at short ranges, could allow the Arafura to become something of a small boat specialist, capable of low-cost, high-accuracy strikes against fast attack boats or kamikaze surface drones of the kind seen in the Russia-Ukraine war, which clearly present a threat to major surface combatants, but which hardly seem to justify the use of a full-size anti-ship missile, of which most vessels have only a very limited magazine. It's easy to imagine an Arafura class sitting at the entry to a harbour, or a kilometre or so offshore from an amphibious operation, launching loitering munitions against any potentially hostile small craft as they approach, allowing the larger ships to focus on other threats. Finally, perhaps the most significant strength of the upgrade package is one which we touched on briefly before. By using modular systems and leveraging the Arafura and its reference design's existing strengths and capabilities, CivMec could likely get this upgrade done for a relatively manageable cost and in a reasonable time frame. With no major redesigns likely to be required, this could probably make up part of an extended maintenance cycle and wouldn't necessarily need to affect the current ongoing build drumbeat much, if at all. So, it seems quick, cheap, and would add some much needed capability to the Arafura. Why not go straight ahead with it? Well, leaving aside the minor point that neither government nor Navy have apparently asked for the upgrade, there are a few points working against it. For one thing, the upgrade package does seem to assume the use of at least part of the flight deck, or at the very minimum, it's considered an option to use it. The Arafura currently equips no organic ISR asset of any material scale, with that program having been scrapped in 2022, and losing even part of the flight deck might limit the vessel's ability to add one at a later date, restricting its value as a surface warfare or small boat specialist. Without airborne ISR, the OPV's ability to identify targets will be limited to the ship's own sensors and its own horizon. A decent-sized, networked reconnaissance drone operating at even moderate altitude with modern optics could provide targeting data to the ship, allowing it to engage more distant targets sooner and giving it a significantly greater impact. Fortunately, the vessel seems to still have at least some amount of deck space available, and the IMDO-PAC model seems to be using the flight deck purely for additional loitering munitions, which is presumably optional. Until fairly recently, suitable drones might have included the Schiebel S-100, though the Navy has now officially phased these drones out, with the new plan being to operate the RQ-21 Blackjack across both Army and Navy. These are smaller drones than the S-100 and are fixed-wing rather than rotary, but can be launched from aboard ship using a portable catapult or a VTOL rig, and recovered using a vertical cable recovery system called Skyhook. This seems relatively straightforward in theory, though the practicalities of utilising this system on a relatively small flight deck, and with a limited crew, will presumably need to be worked out over time if the MQ-21 is adopted. Another, perhaps more significant concern, however, is that the capability enhancement package offers no apparent upgrade to the radar, making air defence challenging, even given the larger caliber main gun and potential for proximity-fused munitions. So far, in the coverage of CivMec's proposed upgrade, there has been no mention of any plans to upgrade the vessel's radar. The OPVs are currently equipped only with the Terma Scantus 6002 surveillance radar, which is used primarily for things like airspace deconfliction and surface tracking, as opposed to providing firing solutions for stealthy or fast-moving targets like cruise missiles or armed drones. In my earlier video, I suggested that CEA Technologies' CTAC radar could be a suitable potential upgrade, as a relatively capable, low-weight, domestically designed and produced AESA radar, the same type which is currently the core of the sensor package for Australia's NASAMS air defence batteries. Now, in fairness, there seems to be no immediately obvious way that such a radar could be installed on the Arafura without the kind of significant redesign that this upgrade seems to have been specifically formulated to avoid, and it's probably a reasonable upgrade to cut if avoiding such a redesign was one of CivMec's priorities. However, lack of meaningful air defence was something that the DSR specifically called out as a key weakness of the Arafura design, and while proximity-fused ammunition on the 57mm gun could go some way towards addressing this problem, without a capable radar to guide it, the armament alone isn't going to be sufficient to defend the vessel in many scenarios. A contrasting, but in some ways just as concerning pattern emerges when you look at the ship's ASW capabilities, or those proposed by CivMec. Though designed with an emphasis on affordability for smaller vessels, the proposed CAPDAS-1 system is still capable, using the same basic technology as the CAPDAS-4 system, which will one day equip the Hunter class, though obviously with significant sacrifices made in the downscaling. So, unlike in the air defence domain, where the upgraded Arafura will have a moderately capable weapon but no specialist sensors, underwater, the Arafura will have a competent sonar to detect threats, but it will lack an obvious way of engaging anything under the water, either with onboard armament or an embarked ASW helicopter. This problem could plausibly be partially mitigated if the ship were intended to carry one or more Ghost Shark or Speartooth type USVs, which could potentially be deployed to prosecute any identified targets. Alternatively, the Arafura could possibly be equipped with something like a VLS-mounted anti-submarine rocket in a container-based system like the Mark 70 from Lockheed Martin, though neither of these solutions have been specifically mentioned by CivMec, and presumably, eventually, we have to start thinking about buoyancy and weight limitations if we keep chucking stuff into the hull. Most likely though, CivMec probably envision the Arafura's upgraded ASW capabilities as being used as part of a larger task force, paired with another ship or possibly something like a P-8 Poseidon, with solo ASW operations not necessarily on the table. Finally, there is the unavoidable trade-off between capability and endurance. Every new system or weapon that the ship wasn't designed for adds weight, increasing the amount of fuel it takes to push the ship through the water, and most will need additional people to operate and maintain them, placing further demands on accommodation and messing facilities as well as food storage space. Given that OPVs like the Arafura are designed to emphasize range and endurance, this feels like a trade-off worth making, but it's not inconceivable that RAN may have already decided on a role for the Arafuras which relies on this range, but which doesn't necessarily require the additional armament, such as patrolling within PNG's extensive exclusive economic zone as part of the newly signed Puk-Puk Defence Treaty. If so, they might choose to prioritise that role over the potential to improve its combat capability. So, clearly, the upgrade would have its strengths and its weaknesses. But despite those weaknesses, it's also fairly clear that the Arafura that emerged out the other side of this kind of an upgrade package would be a substantial improvement on the current model. So, what could the newly upgunned Arafura actually do within the fleet? Let's consider a few potential roles. Firstly, it's worth mentioning that apart from those likely minor hits to range and endurance, none of these upgrades seem likely to prevent or seriously hinder the Arafuras in their constabulary role. The class will continue to be a capable long-range patrol ship. It will still contribute to regional presence missions, combat smuggling and illegal fishing, and participate as needed in search and rescue operations, just as it would without the upgrade. But will also be able to do more. One obvious role that they could play is as a credible platform to serve as a shadow for potentially hostile vessels in Australian waters. A major concern of mine has been that Australia's surface fleet is shrinking, and yes, this means I'm going to get that same graph out again. Australia's combined fleet of major surface combatants, ANZACs and Hobarts, is almost certain to dip below 10 next year when HMAS Arunta is slated to retire, and even with the Megamis coming online, is unlikely to go back above 10 until the mid-2030s. While most commentary around this fact has focused on Australia's vulnerability in the event of a major war, generally assumed to be with China and potentially as soon as the final few years of this decade, the diminishment of the surface fleet's numbers has implications in peacetime as well. Australia's ability to undertake basic naval tasks, like escorting potentially hostile vessels in our waters, may come into question if we allow the surface fleet to drop too far below optimal numbers. We saw the RAN challenged by this task earlier this year after China sent a task force to circumnavigate Australia. Most of the available vessels in the combined major surface fleet of both the Australian and New Zealand navies at the time participated in the escort mission, suggesting very little slack in the system. If these kinds of activities become more common and the RAN continues to shrink, it will only become more difficult to maintain this kind of presence. Excluding landing craft, the only naval vessels of any meaningful size coming off Australian production lines this decade are almost certainly going to be Arafuras, and while this capability enhancement package certainly wouldn't make them true warships, a fact that cannot be emphasised enough, if it were undertaken, it would at least allow the Arafuras to take some of the pressure off our existing fleet in roles such as escorting potentially hostile ships through our waters. In fact, given their range and endurance, they're probably actually a great choice for the role, but it's something they can't credibly do right now as a purely constabulary-focused OPV. Even simply deploying a towed array to demonstrate our ability to identify an escorting nuclear submarine, the presence or absence of which was a topic of hot speculation in the Australian media during the incident, would be valuable, and it's a capability that is currently limited to merely 3 surface combatants in the Navy, the Hobart-class AWDs. Outside of these more symbolic roles during peacetime, an Arafura, upgunned in this manner, would provide significant value in wartime as well. Not so much as an independent asset operating alone, but more as a supplementary capability which could significantly improve our aging ANZAC-class frigates. Consider a 2-ship pair, an ANZAC and an upgunned Arafura operating together. The two vessels complement each other extremely well. In an ASW context, the Arafura provides a towed array for long-range targeting, while the ANZAC offers the dipping sonar-equipped Romeo Seahawk helicopter, which is capable of both identifying targets and prosecuting them using its lightweight torpedoes. In the air, the ANZAC's extremely capable CFAR-2 radar and 32 Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles could provide basic air defense for both ships, while the Arafura could provide local anti-surface defense against surface drones through its loitering munitions. The ANZAC alone lacks any real defense against this type of weapon, the threat from which only seems to grow as the vessels become more advanced and begin to proliferate beyond the Black Sea. Finally, in a larger scale anti-surface role, an Arafura could expand the ANZAC's anti-ship cruise missile throw weight by 50%, significantly increasing its ability to potentially overwhelm hostile air defenses. And all of this assumes that more varied and interesting uses aren't found for the Arafura's modular containerized equipment slots, which could do potentially any number of things, from supplementing the ANZAC's VLS stocks to equipping the Arafura with containerized directed energy weapons, electronic warfare or surveillance suites, or any number of things that cleverer people than me come up with. Deployed together, an ANZAC and an upgunned Arafura pairing would be far greater than the sum of its parts, and, of course, far more dangerous on the modern naval battlefield than either vessel individually. A full fleet of 6 upgraded Arafuras could keep the ANZACs relevant in combat longer than they otherwise might be as they head towards retirement. But what about solo operations? I've put out a couple of videos in the past talking about the need for small, moderately capable combatants which can be built domestically in large numbers, harkening back to the World War II era Bathurst-class corvette. And the upgunned Arafura, at first glance, seems to be just that. So, could the capability-enhanced Arafura fit the niche of the modern Bathurst corvette? Well, unfortunately, at first glance, I don't think so. Bathursts weren't particularly advanced or capable combatants, even by the standards of their day. They took on critical but low-risk duties, such as convoy escort, mine hunting, ASW and troop transportation, and in so doing, freed up larger and more capable Australian naval assets to take on more dangerous tasks. A modern version of the Bathurst would need to have enough combat capability to take on these sorts of duties in a potential near-future conflict, but also be both cheap enough to be manufactured in large numbers and easy enough to manufacture that they could be built in multiple facilities around the country with minimal retooling or upgrades to shipyards. The Arafura, however, at 1,600 tonnes and built of steel, isn't exactly the kind of vessel that Australia's shipyards are necessarily set up to build, though I suppose that might be a solvable problem with enough money thrown at it. What's less easily solved, however, is that the Arafura is let down in air defence, but more critically, in ASW. Without over-the-horizon ISR, particularly from an organic ASW helicopter, or any long-range torpedo options by default, and without a better radar or more comprehensive air defence suite, even the post-upgrade Arafura just couldn't be expected to handle the most critical and asset-intensive missions we would need them to cover. ASW escort to keep the sea lines of communication open across the Indian and Southern Pacific Oceans. The problem is that, even post-upgrade, while the Arafura will provide significant supplementary capabilities and will be able to take on some warship-like roles in peacetime, in wartime, it's simply not going to be able to be a standalone combat asset, even in lower-tier theatres. That's not to say, however, that the class couldn't eventually reach the point where it could be deployed alone under very specific circumstances. Now, I admit we're starting to stray into personal preference and fantasy upgrade territory here, but if it were up to me, I would very much treat this as just one step in the upgrade process, a band-aid solution to an undergunned ship, giving them some capability quickly without the costs or delays associated with a major redesign. Extracting maximum value out of the class, however, will take more work. In the very short term, some kind of embarked medium to large scale drone to offer organic over-the-horizon ISR. In the medium term, the capability enhancement upgrade as proposed by CivMec looks great, cheap and quick to implement without major yard time. In the longer term, however, the vessels need to solve their biggest weakness, air defense. And that, unfortunately, almost certainly means redesigns and some time out of the water to upgrade the mast with something like a SeaTac radar, and maybe even a more capable air defense weapon than the 57mm gun alone, assuming the vessels have the space and buoyancy available to add such things without completely compromising their ability to perform their constabulary duties during peacetime. Such an upgrade will be expensive, and might be seen by the government or Navy as throwing good money after bad. But in combination with the upgrades proposed by CivMec in this package, should finally see the Arafura become the ship it has always had the potential to be. Limited, yes, particularly in the air defense domain, where anything more potent than drones and subsonic cruise missiles would probably fall beyond its capabilities to deal with, but substantially more useful and more survivable than the vessel as it exists today. But even if the government doesn't choose to go that extra step, personally, I think they should take up this offer from CivMec as soon as possible. And the reason I think that is ultimately pretty straightforward. Yes, the upgrade has its limitations, and we've talked about them. Incomplete ASW and air warfare suites, and a limited ability to operate alone. But even with only this halfway house of an upgrade, we would see the Arafuras evolve rapidly from undergunned, oversized constabulary vessels without a role in wartime into minor warships. Unquestionably limited warships, not even what we class as Tier 2, but warships nonetheless. Warships which have the potential to make the surface fleet, at least in aggregate, more potent and capable in the critical next few years to the end of the decade than it is otherwise likely to become before the mid-2030s, and all without needing to put any more boats into the water or recruit any material number of new sailors the Navy were already planning to do anyway. And that means significantly more capability without needing to spend commensurately significant amounts of money. And in today's strategic environment, that sounds worth it to me.